Hey, world history students. We are going to continue with our notes today, so go ahead and pull up your World War II note booklet. We're going to start on booklet 3. And if you haven't done so already, I'll give you a second to do that. Remember, these are some random pictures from that time period. Um, We've got devastation from the bombing of London. We've got Pearl Harbor, which we're actually just about to talk about. We've got pictures of Hitler and his audiences. We've got famous picture from the Great Depression. D-Day, we'll get there soon. Returning from World War II, people being excited about that. A kid getting shoes in the Great Depression. How excited he is to get a pair of shoes. The Holocaust, which we'll be talking about soon. This is dropping of nuclear bomb. You can see how devastating that's going to be. This is a famous statue and picture from the Americans on Iwo Jima. And then this is the famous propaganda in Great Britain. Keep calm and carry on. All right, let's get started. All right. Course of the war, Japan and allies. All right, so on December 7th, 1941, this is a famous date. Not only famous, but it has its own famous name, which is the date that will live in infamy, which means like infamous, famous. Um, this is the day that Japanese aircrafts attack the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. So this was a huge deal. America isn't just being pulled into the war out of trying to help allies or because they think it's right, but they are actually being attacked. So Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor uh, was used to keep the Americans from interfering in Japan's war in the Pacific. So the goal for Japan was if we can devastate the American Navy in the Hawaiian Islands, which is the jumping off point for all of their military, the Americans' military in the Pacific, then the Japanese believed they could keep the Americans out of the war and not interfere with them. Well, we know in hindsight that that actually did the exact opposite and instead brought Americans fully into the war. So the attack on Pearl Harbor was the final straw to put the United States fully into the war. Prior to Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was supporting allies by giving resources and enforcing trade restrictions on the Axis countries. The U.S. now joined with European nations and nationalist China in a combined effort to defeat Japan. So the United States was in the war prior to this, but mostly just from an economic standpoint. So either giving resources to the Allies or restricting resources to Japan. Prior to Pearl Harbor happening, the United States was the primary oil producer for Japan. So they were funding a lot of Japan's and providing for a lot of Japan's war effort. And then when Americans realized that, or American government realized that, they said, oh, we should probably stop doing that. So they stopped, which really hurt Japan in their war effort. And so there were ways that America was involved, but now we are fully going to be involved. This is a famous picture from the attacks at Pearl Harbor. Prior to 9/11, September 11th, 2001, it was the biggest attack on American soil against Americans. So, believing American involvement in the Pacific would make U.S. ineffective in the European theater of war, Hitler declared war on the U.S. 4 days after Pearl Harbor. So, Hitler says, you know what, I didn't want America involved, but since they're going to be involved in the Pacific against Japan, might as well go ahead and declare war on them too, because they're not going to be able to fight in Europe and in the Pacific. On June 22nd, 1942, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Hitler decided that Stalingrad, a major industrial center in the Volga River, should be taken first. Stalingrad was perhaps the most terrible battle in the war. Now we're talking all of the war here. From November 1942 to February 1943, the Germans and Soviets fought. The German Sixth Army, considered the best of the German troops, lost. An early winter and fierce Soviet resistance halted the German advances. So when you look back in World War II, a lot of the biggest battles, both the most deaths and some of the most important, come on the western side of the Soviet Union as Germany's trying to move their way into what is now Russia. So despite the early success, Germany failed to win major victories over Britain or Russia. So remember, Germany has taken over pretty much all of Europe, which was a huge deal because Europe's a tough place to conquer. Tons and tons of people have tried over the thousands of years. But Germany and Hitler successfully did that and took over almost all of it. Remember, we had that map we showed earlier that showed how much of Europe Germany took over. But Great Britain and Russia maintained their strengths and were able to stop the Germans and ultimately help defeat Germany. At the beginning of 1943, the Allies, which are Great Britain, the US, France, and the Soviet Union, keep that in mind because that will be on your test for sure, agreed to fight until the Axis powers, which were Germany, Italy, and Japan, surrendered unconditionally. Now, this is a big deal because you can decide to fight until you've pretty much won. You know, there's a point in competition when you're like, okay, we've pretty much won. We don't have to continue. No, they were going to fight until there was an unconditional surrender. That means they surrender and get no say in what happens. They wanted to completely destroy the Axis powers, and they weren't going to stop until then. Japan was dominant in the Pacific. The turning point of the war in Asia came on June 4th at the Battle of Midway Island. There's a really good movie out called Midway that's all about this battle. The U.S. defeated the Japanese Navy and established naval superiority in the Pacific. The Americans then went on the offensive and began island hopping, taking Japanese-held islands. Before I get down to this map, if you ever look at a map of the Pacific and Asia, you see there's all of these islands along continental Asia. And in order for the United States to defeat the Japanese, they essentially had to take over an island, beat Japan there, and then go from island to island to island to island until they made their way to Japan. Because Japan had already taken over all this area. And in order to continue to get closer to them, they had to continue doing all this island hopping, which was incredibly challenging to do because Japan had done so well of really digging into these islands and literally digging in because they built all of these underground mazes and made it extremely hard to fight. Okay, World War II, European theater. That's what they call certain parts of the war. All right, so you can see from 1940 to 1945 what's going on here. We've got different movements. So we've got the Axis forces in the blue, like these ones here. The Allied forces in the red, like these ones moving here. Major battles, you see London right there, major battle in Great Britain. The green area in the middle, Germany, all the way down through Italy, that is the Axis nations. So this is what Germany is holding. This Cream colored is what's occupied by the Axis powers. So they have control over it down here. Um, Not necessarily full control, but they pretty much have it. And allied nations are here in this blue. So really, in this map, only Great Britain from the Allied powers. Now, we have Russia over here. We have the United States coming in eventually. But right now, this is pretty much all held by the Axis powers. All right. So the last years of the war. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces under U.S. Dwight D. Eisenhower landed on the Normandy beaches in history's greatest naval invasion. You will hear about this for the rest of your life. This is what we call D-Day. Now, American forces landed on Normandy. There's Omaha. There's a handful of these French beaches that the Allies had to get to and then storm in order to get onto the land before they could start attacking the Germans. And different countries went onto different beaches. We often hear about Omaha and Normandy. We hear about these certain places that Americans went, but other countries, Canada and whatnot, did help on these other beaches we don't hear quite as much about in our country. The Allies fought their way past hidden underwater mines, treacherous barbed wire, and horrible machine gun fire. Believing the battle was a diversion and the real invasion would occur elsewhere, the Germans responded slowly. Within 3 months, the Allies had landed 2 million men and 500,000 vehicles. Allied forces then began to push inland and broke through the German defensive lines. So D-Day is this huge, huge event that if the Allies don't succeed in, then there's a very good chance that they don't end up pulling off and turning around the war. At least not then, and would have taken a lot longer, if ever. But they were able to successfully convince Nazi Germany and Hitler that a real attack was going to go on somewhere else, and that this one was just a diversion, when really it was the opposite. General Patton, as I think you guys saw in your video, literally inflated fake tanks and had them on the beaches in England, which added to the idea that this invasion that was going to be happening in Normandy was not the real thing. And so Germany was slow to get their forces there. Despite that, it was still incredibly scary and brutal to storm these beaches. If you ever see the movie Saving Private Ryan, they have a really great scene at the beginning that shows this. These guys are pulling up on ships. Think of you and all your classmates. Remember, these are young men. You and all your classmates standing on this boat, and the only thing between you and enemy machine gun fire is this metal wall that's about to be let down so you can get off. So as soon as it comes down, the machine gun fire is coming through at you and all of your soldiers with you. So it was incredibly scary. But this also adds to why people often consider this one of the biggest days in battle history, at least contemporary wise, and that this would being such a brave, heroic act. So Allied troops liberated Paris by the end of August 1944. In March 1945, they crossed through the Rhine River and advanced into Germany. So now that Allied forces have regrouped, are stronger, made their way into France, they are now starting to push their way into Germany. After Stalingrad, the Soviets moved west. So remember, the Soviets are coming from the other side. Reoccupying Ukraine by the end of 1943, they moved into the Baltic states by early 1940. So now we've got French, uh, American, and British, as well as Canadian and some other help, coming in from the west. We've got Russians moving in from the east, trying to come to the middle and meet in Germany and take it over. Advancing along a northern front, Soviet troops occupied Warsaw in January 1945 and entered Berlin in April. At the end of April, Allied armies in northern Germany moved towards the Elbe River, where they linked up with the Soviets. So they're converging in the middle in Berlin. April 30th, 1945, Hitler commits suicide. 2 days after Italian resistance fighters shot Mussolini. On May 7th, 1945, Germany surrenders. The war in Europe is finally over. You see the New York Times headline, "The war in Europe has ended. Surrender is unconditional. VE, victory in Europe, will be proclaimed today. Our troops on Okinawa gain." So, as you can see here, people are very excited about the war in Europe ending, but American troops in Okinawa, which is the Pacific against Japan, are still going on. So despite the war in Europe ending, the war in Asia continued. Beginning in 1943, U.S. forces had gone on the offensive, and Allied military power drew closer to main Japanese islands early in 1945. So remember, they're getting closer, trying to get to Japan. Harry S. Truman, who became president after Roosevelt died in April. Remember, Roosevelt had multiple terms. There's all kinds of different things we can learn about FDR. But remember, he worked his way through the Great Depression and then led us into World War II. So Truman is the president, but he has to make this very incredibly difficult decision. Truman could send troops to invade mainland Japan at a likely cost of many American troops, or he could drop the newly developed atomic weapons. So the decision, do we invade Japan and risk thousands and thousands of Americans dying and the war continuing and going on longer? Or do we drop atomic weapons in Japan and kill, at this point we don't know how many will die, but it's going to be thousands and thousands and thousands of not just Japanese military, but Japanese civilians. So it's a tough decision that our President Truman is going to have to make. Decides to go with the atomic weapons, and the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Actual totals could not be counted, but it is estimated that 150,000 people died at Hiroshima and 75,000 people died at Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 14th, 1945. World War II had finally come to an end, where total losses are estimated between 60 and 85 million people worldwide. So I want to talk slightly more about dropping the atomic bombs. 75,000 people in one city and 150,000 people in another city die almost instantly. You know, September 11th was huge in our country, and we had a few thousand people, talking a little over 3,000 people, if I remember right. And that was horrific, terrible. It's a date we won't forget. These Japanese cities lost 150,000 people, and we're not just talking military. Like in September 11th, these are civilians. These are just people going to work, going to school, kids, children, everyone. Um, so these are really devastating things to do to a city, to people, to a country. Um, and one of the reasons Truman decided to make this choice was the resilience and amazing dedication that Japanese soldiers had. Was this never surrender, never quit mentality. And Truman believed that the only way to get the Japanese to surrender is to take these drastic measures on an epic scale, which is why there was a second bomb dropped. After the first bomb dropped and killed 150,000 people instantly, they still did not surrender. So a few days later, dropped a second bomb. And at that point, Japan realized that this is not something that they can continue to have. And no one else in the world had this technology yet. So there was no threat of trying to do something back. This was a bombing and a weapon on a scale that no one in the world had ever seen or necessarily even believed was possible. The footage from it's crazy. So this is going to lead a lot of people define history by what happened before atomic weapons and what will happen after, or what has happened after atomic weapons. These bombs are so big and so devastating that it's going to define history moving forward after this. Immediately after, we had the Cold War, which is a buildup of Soviet Union's military and atomic weapons, and the United States doing the same thing and trying to take over places. We'll talk more about that later, but just know that these events right here at the end of the war in Japan change history as we know it. All right. For one tough topic to the next class, we're not going to start on the Holocaust now, but next class we're going to talk about the Holocaust. So be ready for that. Feel free to ask your parents or family members about any of this stuff. Lots of people in their family love to talk about World War II. So ask around. There's lots of good information out there. Hope you guys are doing well. I will talk to you soon.